The play was a standard corner route. Doran Maronic, rising senior and star receiver of the Bear River High School Bruins, launched up the field, cleats throwing grass and dirt as he cut an angle toward the end zone. He'd been getting looks from the nation's top college football programs, letters from premier lacrosse teams, Division I titans with colossal locker rooms and rabid fans and beaming cheerleaders and a path to the pros. The 2-year-old down the block looked to him like a boyfriend, a classmate with autism at Bear River as his best friend, and just about anyone who follows high school sports saw in this teen from just northeast of Sacramento one of the top prospects in the state. Thundering toward the far corner on June 24, Doran stretched his arms and reaching for his second touchdown of the game, his fifth in this non-contact weekend tournament. Two spectators standing on the narrow sideline had their backs turned. They were watching the scrimmage on the next field, oblivious as his 180-pound frame sailed toward them. Doran slammed into them head first. Doctors suspect he blacked out before he even hit the ground, his brain smashing against the rough inner surface of his skull. Then it got rocked again, the pivotal blow, when his head, protected by just a soft-shelled helmet, crashed to the turf. His father, David, was watching from the sidelines. At first I thought he twisted an ankle or worst-case scenario broke an arm or leg or something, David says. And then he just started shaking like crazy, and I took off across the field, and he was in a full seizure and bleeding from the mouth. In seconds, Doran, 16, transformed from varsity athlete to trauma victim. Headlines called it a freak accident, the terrible injury in a tackle-free tournament. But the outcome was undeniable. Doran, alive yet his brain damaged, was apparently the first boy of the 2016 high school football season to be hurt or killed by head trauma, and still weeks before the official start of preseason camps. But Doran soon took on another role. Within days, his parents got a call from a former TV honcho, a man whose career once called for promoting the NFL's huge hits and giant tacklers. The man told Doran he wanted to make him the first subject of an unlikely new research effort he was launching, a project also being led by one of the world's top neurosurgeons, a doctor who'd made a career studying the very damage wrought by those huge hits and giant tacklers every Sunday and Monday, not to mention the NCAA Saturdays, the Friday night fights and the Friday night lights on football fields across the country. The duo plans to investigate head injuries, a 6-year effort they'll fund themselves for now but for which they say they're desperately seeking funding, as much as $1 million a year. The two men believe that by its end, the investigation will point to a prime culprit they've been tracking for years, the traumatic brain injury that's very existence is still debated by some scientists, yet one that grows more real with each new casualty, the deadly condition that appears most cruelly to prey almost exclusively on young athletes, second impact syndrome. Its signature is swelling, dramatic swelling, the brain pushing against not just the skull but sometimes down into the spinal column. Most doctors suspect the brain's plumbing breaks, unleashing a flood of blood and fluid, caused, as its name suggests, not by one blow but two, first a malfunction and then a full rupture. The blows can be separated by seconds or by weeks. But much else, from why it occurs to why it seems to strike only young men, remains a mystery. We couldn't lose another year of watching these reports and realizing that we're burying these boys without exactly knowing what killed them, says Terry O'Neill, who worked as an executive for ABC's Monday Night Football, CBS Sports and NBC Sports from 1980 to 1993. There's no national governing body for the 1.1 million boys expected to play middle and high school football this season, no nationwide research of the game's casualties. The tally of players who have been injured or killed by second impact syndrome starts at 17 but climbs to dozens, depending on who's counting. Yet for all the uncertainty, one fact seems clear: it is utterly preventable. And that frustrates Dr. Robert Cantu, a leading expert on brain trauma and O'Neill's partner on the project. The same damn thing happens every year, and we're not getting answers, Cantu says. So O'Neill has put himself on call. With the start of preseason camps this month, he plans to respond to just about any catastrophic head injury or fatality in a high school football game or practice, interview parents and coaches and teammates to learn everything possible about the stricken player, gain whatever medical records he can, then had it all sent to Cantu, who's being assisted by 2 imaging experts at the National Institutes of Health. When an airplane goes down, a group of experts are summoned to the site to figure out what happened, what went wrong, so it can be prevented in the future, Cantu says. We ought to treat all of the athletic deaths, especially those that we don't fully understand, equally aggressively. Doran is their patient number 1. The numbers. It wasn't until this spring, after decades of research, screening headlines and a $1 billion legal settlement, that the nation's wealthiest and most powerful sports league acknowledged a connection between repeated head blows and brain disease. Only during congressional testimony did NFL Senior Vice President Jeff Miller allow that chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, is linked to head trauma. Even then, the league apparently kept playing fast and loose with the data. Most recently, it got caught promoting the study it said showed that a high-profile safety initiative, Heads Up Football, prevented concussions, when in fact the study had reached no such conclusion. Cantu spent years fighting to call attention to CTE. As medical director of the National Center for Catastrophic Sport Injury Research at UNC Chapel Hill, an investigator for the CTE Center at Boston University and clinical professor of neurosurgery at Boston University School of Medicine, he'd collected samples from the brains of dead athletes felt by dementia and published studies. Reflecting the findings, second impact syndrome would seem an easier fight. Blows too soft to cause concussions can still cause CTE, allowing the disease to spread unnoticed for decades, and its connection to football to be denied by coaches, the NFL, the NCAA and youth organizations. Second impact syndrome, by contrast, appears to require an initial concussion, giving coaches a chance to pull a player, and keep him on the sidelines, before he takes another hit. CTE can't be diagnosed until after death. Concussions can be revealed with a quick sideline exam or 30-minute computerized test, which can expose symptoms like headache, nausea or memory loss. Courts have already weighed in, approving settlements of $2.8 million in New Jersey and $7.5 million in Pennsylvania for football players killed and permanently injured, respectively, by suspected second impact syndrome. Yet since Cantu and O'Neal first met in Boston in 2013, and despite meetings with high-profile philanthropic foundations and even the NFL, the pair has struggled to gain traction. While NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, in a letter made public this spring, declared the league has a unique responsibility and opportunity to drive change and advance progress in the prevention and treatment of head injuries, which he called a commitment to players, former players, athletes at all levels. The league has yet to offer funding. We are reviewing the proposal as we do with all scientific research proposals with our medical and scientific advisors, NFL spokesman Brian McCarthy says in a statement. One challenge is numbers. The big problem is that it's rare, and there is no organization, no group like the Huntington's Disease Society of America, to get the word out to family members and student athletes, says Dr. Walter Koroshes, who leads the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at NIH. The number of young football players who die from head trauma is just a fraction of the game's death toll each season, which itself is minuscule compared to the number who participate. Of all the middle and high school boys who suited up in pads and helmets in the past 3 years, just 7 died directly as a result of on-field injuries in 2015, 5 in 2014 and 8 the year before, according to data compiled by the National Center for Catastrophic Sport Injury Research, largely pulled from media reports. That's an incidence rate of 0.58 per 100,000 athletes. Yet every year since 1995, at least one middle or high school student has died from playing football, a third from a direct impact like head trauma or a spinal fracture, according to the National Center. Many died as early as the August preseason, when states place relatively few limits on contact. Inevitably, you just do the math on this around the country, you can predict there's going to be something very serious by the end of the month, says O'Neal, who now runs Practice Like Pros, the coaching and advocacy group working to limit contact in practice and eliminate tackling before 9th grade. You can just count on it. This season's already claimed its first fatal victim, just 10 days into practices. Lewis Simpkins, 14, who collapsed during drills at River Bluff High School in South Carolina on Wednesday. The cause of death was under investigation Thursday. the leaky faucet to the families and communities torn apart by grief and recrimination and lawsuits, the toll is anything but minor, some kind of unavoidable outgrowth of playing the country's most popular contact sport. They're intimately familiar with the syndrome's horrific details. The pipes that carry blood to the brain, known as arterioles, can expand and contract to regulate blood flow. In second impact syndrome, however, the arterioles malfunction, dilating and opening the flood that engorges the brain. Among the only treatments is to remove parts of the skull, a strategy that's also used in car crashes. Even then, hope is slim. It's like a leaky faucet, and the water's going everywhere. It's no longer going right out the outlet, it's spraying all over the kitchen, Khorrashid says. There's no place for the water to go inside the skull, so it just pushes on everything. It's a situation that's often powerless, he says, and highly fatal. But there seems to be a trend. Many, if not most, victims had suffered a previous concussion, some during the very game, others a few days or few weeks prior but still suffering the symptoms, indicating their brains had not yet healed. In cases where no first impact was apparent, Cantu and O'Neill suspected it may have come during the same game or practice but was masked by the player from his coaches and teammates. These kids are good at hiding it, says O'Neill, whose son, a quarterback at Tufts University, suffered 2 concussions playing football in high school. It's another dimension of the whole syndrome. It's really not clinically diagnosable, and if you're good at it and insistent, you can hide the symptoms and stay on the field. And that makes them vulnerable. Something seems to break in that second hit, before the brains had a chance to recover. If that's true, what's unclear is why, the mechanism, that causes the arterioles to malfunction. Nor do doctors know why of the hundreds, if not thousands, of players who surely hide headaches, dizziness and other signs of a concussion from their coaches and trainers every season, only a few suffer second impact syndrome. One survey of college football players from 2014 found that for every head injury an athlete reported, another 27 went unreported. Among offensive linemen, that number rose to 32. There probably are a couple of genetic issues or environmental issues that put the small number of kids at risk, but we don't know what they are, says Dr. Meredith Golomb, Associate Professor of Child Neurology at Indiana University School of Medicine. Most pressing, neurologists still don't know why only the young seem to succumb to the syndrome. In one review of 17 confirmed cases from 1946 to 2015 published this year in the journal Pediatric Neurology, and co-authored by Golomb, all the victims were male, and the oldest was 23, most were younger than 18. Whether that's the result of the small sample size or precondition of second impact syndrome, no one knows. Nobody has a clue as to why that would be, Khorrashid says. You have all these NFL players getting concussion after concussion and you don't see it. The young brain is different than the older brain, it changes, so that might be the answer. But short of any in-depth investigation or peer-reviewed study, he adds, speculation amounts to little more than hand-waving. What does seem apparent, however, is the danger posed by taking first one hit and then another. That's why, for a condition that's also sometimes known as dysautoregulation or malignant brain edema, so many insist on the term second impact syndrome. It's telling you that it's preventable. If you had the means to understand that this brain's already been injured, the kid never should be playing, Cantu says. It implies there's something that can be done about it. Good intentions. In 2009, Washington became the first state to pass the Zachary Listed Law, named for a high school football player left permanently brain damaged from suspected second impact syndrome. The measure set standards for when youth athletes with concussion symptoms have to be sidelined, when they're allowed back on the field, and includes education components for players, coaches and parents. Since then, every state and the District of Columbia has passed a version of what's become known as the Return to Play Law. The nation's 2 largest youth organizations, USA Football, which is backed by the NFL, and Pop Warner, have instituted similar standards. Yet states have provided little funding to implement or enforce the laws, Cantu says, meaning participation is often effectively voluntary. Unlike in the NFL, there are no state or national registries that track which players sustained concussions or which medical professionals are working the sidelines and deciding which players can return and when. The listed law is a wonderful thing, but the states, the organizations, are not really carrying out what they're talking about, Cantu says. They're talking about the law, but there's no funding for it. What's more, not only can players hide the symptoms of a concussion, but parents, trainers and coaches may also miss, or not want to see, the signs. There's so many of us out there that don't believe what they tell us. I'm the perfect example. You followed how you were taught because you thought that was the right way, says David Maronick, who coached youth football for years as Doran and the boy's younger brother, grew up. Our neurologist told us that's like saying, let's go get in a car crash on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday to prepare for the big car crash Friday. Man, that just sunk in. It's taken an injury like this to my own son to just realize it, to understand it. Part of the challenge is doctors still disagree about the risks, both from head trauma generally and from conditions like CTE and second impact syndrome. Dr. Julian Bales, who pioneered research into CTE and is medical director of Pop Warner, dismissed a January 2015 study that found NFL players who'd played tackle football before age 12 more often developed long-term brain damage, declaring the study's implications for youth tackle football as a whole a big leap and a potentially dangerous message to get out. Dr. Paul McCrory, a neurologist at the University of Melbourne in Australia, published a paper in 2012 concluding that scientific evidence to support the concept of second impact syndrome is non-existent. It's hard to make guidelines to address it when not all physicians agree it exists, Palm, of the Indiana University School of Medicine, says. But, she adds, if you present something new that's frightening, it can be controversial. How many people didn't think smoking caused lung cancer until the evidence became overwhelming? Second impact syndrome has a far smaller sample size than smoking, she acknowledges, which makes drawing any conclusions a challenge. Nonetheless, states and youth football organizations vary widely on even the most fundamental standards governing football. The Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletic Association, for example, has implemented the guidelines for O'Neill's Practice Like Pros, which uses the NFL's model of curtailing contact in practice, the preseason and the off-season. Practice Like Pros also bans tackling entirely before high school. Other leagues have few restrictions on contact during the preseason. 13 states, including Delaware, Louisiana, New York and Texas, have none at all, despite mounting evidence of the long-term damage repeated blows can cause in younger brains. As recently as this summer, USA Football trumpeted on its website the study supporting heads-up football, until the high-profile story in the New York Times revealed the study in fact underscored how heads-up football failed to prevent concussions. Top officials at USA Football have also dismissed or minimized the apparent links between repeated head blows and CTE. Cantu and O'Neill encourages hope, then, not merely to learn what they can about head trauma and second impact syndrome but to harness the findings to teach coaches, teammates and parents how better to recognize concussions, and, more to the point, teach them why they need to care. Ideally, perhaps, the decision shouldn't even rest in the hands of coaches. We're not doctors, so we don't recognize an injury as a doctor recognizes an injury, says Todd Berry, executive director of the American Football Coaches Association, which represents more than 11,000 coaches and members at all levels of the game. It's very difficult sometimes for our coaches to necessarily spot, are you just tired? Or are you suffering here? Doran was among the lucky ones, doctors say. Through hours of speech, physical and occupational therapy, his recoveries outstripped every prognosis. He plans to return to high school this fall to graduate and to return to the field. I'm young, so I'm going to play sports again. That's not one of my goals, that's going to happen. I'm going to be on the field on Friday nights again. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to fully recover and I want to repay everyone who's helped me, he says. He ultimately plans to study biology and become a cancer researcher. For most others, however, much of what's left is devastation, if not death, long years of rehabilitation and questions of what might have been. I don't think anyone should die from playing football when there's a consistency in the injuries that cause the death, says Andrea Williams, whose 19-year-old brother, Drew, suffered severe brain damage in a game in Chicago in 2013. This level of medical attention is necessary to preserve the game. Our children deserve that, she says. Football adds something to a town, to a high school, to a college. It brings so much goodwill, and the students and the children who are participating and entertaining and drawing crowds are not being paid. They at least deserve the appropriate advocacy and medical attention. We at least owe them that.